there is a temptation to change it. Oh my God, it's screwed up. I have come up with something different, he explained. But that's wrong, because you've been planning for it for a certain ending. And if you suddenly change direction just because somebody figured it out or because they don't like it, then it screws up the whole structure. I don't read the fan sites. I want to write the book I've always intended to write all along. And when it comes out, they can like it or they can not like it. George R.R. Martin. Welcome to the Fattest Leech of Ice and Fire. I am your host. I am Leech. I am the one that is doing this crazy analysis style for George R.R. Martin's Martin World. I've read all 80 plus of his stories and have a collection of additional information that all grouped together is called Martin World. Huzzah! This is going to be basically a read through of my page on my blog that is titled That 1993 Outline, Making Up Shit. Why do I call it Making Up Shit? We'll get to that. But it's important to read this outline or to understand it and to go line by line, not only to be able to compare it with Martin World, huzzah, but also to compare it to what we have currently in A Song of Ice and Fire. There's not much that George has actually omitted from this outline, but there are a slew of changes. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why did he make those changes? Why all of a sudden is this happening to Jaime instead of Jon? Or why all of a sudden is this happening to Sansa when he had it planned this way? Or even some of the things that George has decided to keep. A lot of those have to do with Daenerys, which Dany is a character or an archetype more specifically that he has been working with and using over and over again throughout his writing career, such as Cyrene of Lilith and Ash from The Glass Flower, such as elements of Damon Julian in Fever Dream, million more. We won't go through them all right now, but they're there and they're on my blog if you do want to see what the heck I'm talking about. So thinking about this in our modern days now, it seems impossible that George would have to try to convince somebody to pick up a story of his. Why? Why is that? Why did he even have to write this outline? He hates writing outlines. Well, because throughout George's career, he's had ups and he's had downs, and he's done editing, and his friends have worked in publishing. But even through all of his own experience, he has had some failures, some misses. And the one that really got him the hardest from a professional level was what was deemed his failure, that is Armageddon Rag. Okay, side note here, I absolutely love the story Armageddon Rag. It was somewhat of a sales success, but for some reason from the business model side, it was not considered a success. I don't know why. I think it would make a fantastic movie. And it's even the title Armageddon Rag is another way to say A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire is a story about essentially the next long night or Armageddon, and a song is a battle. See how Martin World fits together? Huzzah! Okay, all right. So George had to write this outline. Does he like writing outlines? No. Outlines like this have morphed into what we would call nowadays a query letter or something along those lines. I have a few links on my blog page that explain in depth what a query letter is. They are a freaking nightmare to construct. And I know this from experience. And they're harder to write than the story itself. So if you want to know a little bit more about query letters, again, on my page, there's information. But they're basically just short, punchy synopses that you submit to an agent or even from decades past straight to a publishing house to try to sell your story before or after it is completed, to have it published. George has never actually done that. He says things like he doesn't like it because it removes the spontaneity. We all know that George has this gardening style writing, as he says, as most of us know about. But there's also this quote from George. There are others who outline very, very thoroughly, who know everything they are going to put into a book, what every scene is going to be, what characters are going to be in it, what they are going to say, etc. Their outlines are almost the book in shorthand. I've never been able to work that way. For one thing, it almost feels, if you prepare an outline like that, it almost feels like you've already written the book. George R.R. Martin. This is part of Martin world, is understanding his own intent and what he wants to put into something, not put into something, but in Martin world, it's all there. So that brings us to the outline itself. So while Martin has clearly shifted quite a few of the details, he's rearranged a few relationships, added and mentioned a large number of characters. There's even a large number of very important characters he did not include in the outline. He's still following his same overall larger path, with the ending that he has always planned. Those who read George's old works, as well as following this blog, will see the multiple repeating patterns and archetypes that he has reinforced in his magnum opus, that is The Song of Ice and Fire. And then there is one more little bit that I want to add, and I sort of touched on it a second ago when I talked about Armageddon Rag, the title of that book. So if George is having a do-over because somewhere in his consciousness, having a failure like Armageddon Rag is something he wanted to fix, this is the story. So what does A Song of Ice and Fire means? It means that there is a struggle for humanity's survival against the two dragon extremes. Daenerys and the Targaryens are not the only dragons. Dragons are simply metaphors for power, overarching and controlling power structures. The details in that are they'll be in another video, but they're in the corpse handler videos that I have up most prominently. So what are the two dragons? The ice dragon White Walkers, and then Daenerys and her three-headed fire dragons. George has been planning all along for Daenerys to have the power to bend people to her will, as he says. That, again, is like Cyrene from Lilith and Ash, and like Ananda Kane from Armageddon Rag, like Damon Julian from Fever Dream, and so many others. It's what dragons do. It's this game of mind, this battle across time. The ice dragon others do the same exact thing. Song means a battle, ice and fire, ice then fire. That's how the structure of this series is going. They're both the greatest threats to Westeros. So spake Martin. There's a video from, I forget the date. I want to say it's about 2015. It's on my blog page if you want to see it, where George explains what the title of the series means, which is the threats are the two outlying factors, and they are the dragons. Which brings me to this other quote by George. An interviewer asks him, or says to him, one of the things that strikes me in the recent books is There'll be a major turning point for a character. Then you realize it's been building for hundreds of pages. Do you always plan these huge events and then find ways to build them up? Or do you sometimes write a character's journey and then realize that it's been leading to a huge turning point? And George responds. He says, all the major things have been planned since the beginning, since the early 90s, the major deaths and the general direction of things. Obviously, the details and the minor things have been things that I've discovered along the way. Part of the fun of writing the books is making these discoveries along the journey, but the general structure of the books has been in my head all along. So again, the general structure of the books, the general archetype of the characters in the books, that's all what we're doing when we are discussing Martin World in general. Martin World, huzzah. So who was George even intending for this outline to go to? Like, who was this for? Well, it was a letter to his longtime agent, Ralph Vicinanza. My apologies if I butchered his name, but I think it's Ralph Vicinanza. He passed away in September of 2010, and on George's blog, which I have copied and linked to on this blog page of my own, he writes a very nice tribute to him. I'm not going to go over that right now, but George is writing to somebody with this outline and any additional information. It was supposed to go to just somebody that he knew professionally and personally for a long time. So the outline in question, I have it all typed out if you want to read through it. I've gone line by line and I have noted any changes or adjustments. My notes, of course, are not all of the notes. You guys may have seen something that's a little bit different that I didn't think of, and that's okay. That's all part of the discussion. You know, if you're watching this, go ahead and leave a comment or find me somewhere online, and we can certainly chat about it. I have no problem with that. So he starts the 3-page letter. He says, "Dear Ralph, here are the first 13 pages, 170 pages of the high fantasy novel I promised you, which I'm calling A Game of Thrones. When completed, this will be the first volume in what I see as an epic trilogy with the overall title, A Song of Ice and Fire." George has mentioned this is me talking now. My note. George has mentioned numerous places that he was writing the Thousand Worlds story Avalon when the idea of Bran finding the direwolf pups in the snow came to mind, and he put Avalon, quote, in the drawer. And he hasn't returned to it. I would die to get Avalon, by the way, as my side note to my side note. He has just finished writing The Glass Flower, which I have transcribed on my blog under the reread section if you want to take a reread of The Glass Flower. So he had just finished writing The Glass Flower, and then Avalon. He had started Avalon, and he put Avalon away to write A Song of Ice and Fire. I just want to note and point out here that George tends to write thematically, carry over themes strongly within a short period of his writing time. I'm probably not wording this correctly, but what I'm saying is between finishing The Glass Flower, writing Avalon and what we know about Avalon and Chloronymus, and then immediately thinking of Bran through all of this, he was in his mind, he was building up a very strong green seer within his own literary world. That is the thread, the root, connecting root between these stories at the time, what he was writing, and how he was building on a little bit more and more, doing his own world building with this. So it makes no surprise to me that Bran was the first chapter that George was working on, and we know what Bran is how his arc is going. So then back to George. He says, as you know, I don't outline my novels. I find if I know exactly where the book is going, I lose all interest in writing it. I do, however, have some strong notions as to the overall structure of the story I'm telling and the eventual fate of many of the principal characters in the drama. Roughly speaking, there are 3 major conflicts set in motion in the chapters enclosed. So I want to go back to me for a second. Germ's use of the qualifier exactly reads to me that he knows, it reinforces the idea that he knows the ending that he wants for the large and small arcs. But it's the journey to get there that takes us through his garden path, sticking with that theme. And he has strong notions. So he knows the eventual fate of his main characters because he's been working on them his entire career. So much of what is in A Song of Ice and Fire did not just spontaneously spring to his head for that story alone. No, this has been decades in the work. So the 3 major conflicts that George mentioned are the Ice Dragon Others, then the Red Fire Dragon, and in the middle all of this is the green element, which is King's Landing. And those 2 dragons are the existential threats to humanity, while fighting over King's Landing is a dangerous distraction. Again, Martin discusses this in the video that I have linked in my blog if you want to take a look at it. Okay, so moving on to this next section that George talks about. He says, the first threat grows from the enmity between the great houses of Lannister and Stark as it plays out in a cycle of plot, counterplot, ambition, murder, and revenge, with the Iron Throne of the 7 Kingdoms as the ultimate prize. This will form the backbone of the first volume of the trilogy A Game of Thrones. Yes, we're all giggling at the idea. George thought this was going to be a trilogy. So the first threat is the Fiery House Lannister. You can say that they are a green fire element at this point. Something else I want to point out, and I cannot stress this enough, and if anybody knows me or follows me, I do stress this often, is George has gone on and on in interviews and other stories even, how the Iron Throne is the Ozymandias of Westeros. Yes, I said it. Huzzah. Ozymandias is a political poem, and he wrote it in point blank, quite explicitly into his story, Fever Dream, which is another story that follows the same structure of A Song of Ice and Fire, and having the ship taken from being a silver and white flower top fever dream, that's Stark, that's all the Jon Snow stuff, literally to a red and black fire dragon takes over and renames the ship Ozymandias. There you go. So we're going from a Weirwood rule to Ozymandias red and black fire dragon rule. So the point of the throne is it's not to be coveted. It's not to be preserved. It's not a game that anybody who sits on it is somehow rightful or the winner. Rather, it represents oppression and blood and fire. And George had a few words on that himself. So he says, and yet, it's still not right. It's not the Iron Throne I see when I'm working on The Winds of Winter. It's not the Iron Throne I want my readers to see. The way the throne is described in the books, huge, hulking, black and twisted, with the steep iron stairs in front, the high seat from which the king looks down, emphasis, on everyone in the court. My throne is a hunched beast looming over the throne room, ugly and asymmetric. It's a throne made by blacksmiths, hammering together half-melted, broken, twisted swords, wrenched from the hands of dead men, or yielded up by defeated foes. a symbol of conquest. It has the steps I described and the height from the top. But from on top, the king dominates the throne room, and there are thousands of swords in it, not just a few. This Iron Throne is scary and not at all a comfortable seat, just as Aegon intended. Look on his works, ye mighty, and despair. So, as I mentioned a second ago, Ozymandias comes from the poet Shelley, and what it is it encapsulates metaphorically the outcome of tyrannical wielding of power, that no leader or king can overcome time. That overall, this sonnet paints a picture of an egotistical character who thought of himself without rival, but who was cruel to his and also was cruel to his people. So no, if to win the throne is not the purpose. Okay, so this brings us to the next part that George talks about. He says, the greatest danger of all, however, comes from the north, from the icy waste beyond the wall, where half-forgotten demons out of legend, the inhuman others, raise cold legions of the undead and the never-born, and prepare to ride down on the winds of winter to extinguish everything that we would call life. The only thing that stands between the seven kingdoms and an endless night is the wall. A handful of men in black called the Night's Watch. Their story will be the heart of my third volume, The Winds of Winter. The final battle will also draw together characters and plot threads left from the first two books and resolve all in one huge climax. So the third crisis comes from the north. And let me just back up a quick second. George does sort of jump around a little bit with this because Dany is a bit more of much more of an important figure throughout the story than just this already pre-existing looming threat of the ice dragon others. So Dany's the second, or the final threat. We'll get to her in a minute. So but this is also how he is still keeping all of his elements together, but just rearranging them a little bit. You know, the story is now expanded to at least 7 books. I hope it's only 7 books, because I would like a nice tidy ending at some point. So, and what this serves with talking about the ice dragon others first is that it's foreshadowing for the fire dragon. For instance, Dany's 3 dragons, Viserion, Rhaegal, and Drogon. Sorry, I do that all the time. I'm sorry. Drogon. They are also never born because, as Dany talks about, they are basically soul switched, and as she says, they are born of dead stone. That Daenerys woke with her newly remembered genetic magics. The whole waking the last dragon fever dream that she has. That's what this is. Fire doesn't kill a dragon. Fire births a dragon. Sorry. Fire births a dragon. But George does give us a glimpse into the future books when he mentions the final battle in this section. And this is the ultimate battle for all humanity, as opposed to who rules from that Iron Throne. So again, like, this is not a story that is going to plop somebody else on that Iron Throne. It's actually a destruction of that throne, because it represents an extreme element, an extreme fire element, red fire element, as opposed to the extreme blue fire ice dragon element. What it's doing is it's bringing us back to essentially what runs in the middle, which is the green element. So back to George. The 13 chapters on hand should give you a notion as to my narrative strategy. All 3 of the books will feature complex mosaic of intercutting points of view among various of my large and diverse cast of players. The cast will not always remain the same. Old characters will die and new ones will be introduced. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. Some of the fatalities will include sympathetic viewpoint characters. I want the reader to feel that no one is ever completely safe, not even the characters who seem to be the heroes. The suspense always ratchets up a notch when you know that any character can die at any time. Okay, I want the reader to feel that no one is ever completely safe. He has talked about this so many times that that's what he did with Ned Stark, and that's what he did with Robb Stark. That he set it up that Ned was the hero of all of this, and whoops, Ned died. And then, so then his son, Robb, is going to be the one that avenges him. So this is going to be Robb's avenging story. Nope. Oops, Robb died. So, yeah, he's keeping us on our toes. The line, "the cast will not always remain the same," is important when you consider how many characters the fandom readers assume are late additions or unplanned additions, when if you read Martin World, huzzah, all of these characters have existed. And I'm quite sure that in George's overall planning of this series, that he was just waiting on the right time to introduce so many of these characters. Not that they didn't exist, and he pulled them out of thin air, like Aegon the Sixth. There are elements of him in Fever Dream and The Glass Flower, to name a few. Val, she's always been on Martin World. Always, always, always. I have a whole page of just Val where I'm collecting all of the examples of Val in Martin World. But not only that, major characters like Cersei, Varys, Brynden Bloodraven Rivers, who again, he's always been in Martin World. Melisandre, who came from Bitterblooms, Tywin and Roose and Ramsay Bolton, and Littlefinger. There's so many more that were not ever mentioned in this pitch letter, but that are extremely important to the story that we have so far. But that doesn't mean that my list is that I haven't left anybody off the list. But again, I just want to emphasize that this is a big story, and George was really just waiting for the right time to introduce them. So back to George. He talks about the 5 central characters that are going to make it. A little note here. George says the 5 key players are Tyrion Lannister, Daenerys Targaryen, and 3 of the children of Winterfell, which is Arya, Bran, and the bastard Jon Snow. So Tyrion, Dany, Arya, Bran, Jon. But then when we get to the Balticon 50 report, which happened in 2016, oh yeah, that came from me, by the way. He has revised that list, and I am happy to report once again, that he has added Sansa to that list of important characters. So then George goes on to say that this is going to be, I hope, in parentheses, he says, quite epic. Epic in scale, epic in action, epic in its length. I see all 3 volumes as big books, running about 700 to 800 manuscript pages. So things are just barely getting underway in the 13 chapters I've sent to you. So then George goes on to say a few things about the poor Starks before they get better. A bunch of things are going to happen to the poor Starks before they get together. And I just want to point out that him using the phrase, the poor Starks, he's already, in his mind, he already has his own sympathy for them. He's writing them from as in a sympathetic angle. No matter the terrible things that they go through, no matter what he pushes them up against and the challenges that he puts them through with their character development, from the get-go, he has had a very sympathetic eye for them. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. And he says, Lord Eddard and his wife Catelyn Tully are both doomed and will perish at the hands of their enemies. Ned will discover what happened to his friend Jon Arryn. And then there's a couple of bits of dialogue that are unclear because of the glare on the pictures from this outline when it was taken. There are, the streaks of light, the glares of light that make a few things a little bit difficult to read. This is one of the sections. But a change. Let's talk about the change in this section. Catelyn never went to King's Landing with Eddard, but Arya did. But we know on her way back to Winterfell isn't how another change that George made. So the actual travel plans of some of the major first level players, those were changed right away, between who goes to King's Landing, who goes back to Winterfell, and whatnot. Another change, Arya Stark doesn't escape King's Landing and make it back to Winterfell. Instead, she has this happen to Jane Poole in a really weird, twisted way. So anybody that has read A Song of Ice and Fire knows that there's been quite a few times in the books already that Jane has purposely been baby swapped for Arya. And that's very important to the plot, especially when we get to other ice, like B-level ice dragon elemental people like Ramsay Bolton. But I want to make a note about Jane Poole's name. I'm kind of a sucker for George's naming style. He says, when I met him at Balticon at the dinner, there was a joke made that Jane Poole, I was talking to him about the way Roy Dotrice pronounces names, and I mentioned that Jane Poole kind of sounds like Gene Poole. And he laughed at that. I'm not saying that this is confirming anything one way or the other. I'm just saying that I had this conversation with him and George seemed to like it, and take it as you will. It's a funny little story. And he seemed to really enjoy that and kind of get a chuckle about that, because it takes Arya out of the incest role and puts Jane Poole in there, which is essentially expanding the gene pool, and he got a kick out of that. And the name Poole, the last name Poole, it means that it's somebody that cries querulously or weakly. It's somebody that cries often. If you go through all of the Jane Poole scenes, especially once we get to A Dance with Dragons and she gets back close to Winterfell, she's crying a lot, and she's actually giving herself away by not being the real Arya because of her crying. So yeah, little details matter, but that's the fun stuff that we examine along the way in Martin World. Huzzah. So back to George, each of the contending families will learn it has a member of dubious loyalty in its midst. And then he gets on to Sansa. So he made a change to Sansa. Sansa was engaged to Joffrey, but never married to him and never gave him a son. The outline had Sansa showing her loyalties to the Lannisters, showing her loyalties to Joffrey, and then she marries him and she goes to give him a son. Huge change. Also, Sansa never betrayed her family. There is some fandom contention that when Sansa told Cersei of Eddard's plans to move them back to Winterfell, Cersei sees the Stark family and retinue, and that became Sansa betraying her family, although it is not what Sansa was intending to do. So again, George needed something in his original plot to stay the same, so he had to make some amendments to it. Also, Tyrion ends up marrying Sansa at the horror to everybody, including Tyrion himself. And what we do see Tyrion desiring, especially in his first few chapters or few scenes with Sansa after the wedding and right before the wedding, is he's like, oh, if I marry her, I could get Winterfell. So then we get to another important section. This one has a lot more notes. If you want to read along and see all of the notes on this, the line by lines, it's on my blog. But I would just want to get to a few of them here. George says, young Bran will come out of his coma after a strange prophetic dream, only to discover that he will never walk again. He will turn to magic, at first in the hope of restoring his legs, but later for its own sake. When his father Eddard Stark is executed, Bran will see the shape of doom descending on all of them. But nothing he can say will stop his brother Robb from calling the banners in rebellion. All the North will be inflamed by war. Robb will win several splendid victories and maim Joffrey Baratheon on the battlefield, but in the end, he will not be able to stand against Jaime and Tyrion Lannister and their allies. Robb Stark will die in battle, and Tyrion Lannister will besiege and burn Winterfell. So, yeah, like a second ago, when I mentioned that when right around Tyrion's wedding to Sansa, he thinks to himself a few times, oh, but she's young, but if I do this, I can get Winterfell. Yeah, that's what happens. So even if it is not an actual literal burning, like we see it being transferred later to Ramsay doing because of his desire to usurp the skin changer wargs, we see that in a symbolic way with the Lannisters being a fiery element, and they are going into Winterfell, which is essentially a tree symbol, a free folk tree symbol in the story. So fire always burns a tree. Dragons consume, fire consumes, it feeds the self. So a few changes to this, quite a few changes to this section. Most of all, that the wars move to the Riverlands, in addition to the Bolton and Ramsay Snow betrayals in the North. So that is a part that George has expanded. All of the Bolton stuff and Ramsay stuff, like 99.9% of that has come straight from George's werewolf story called Fever Dream. I've been talking about this for years, including some stuff with Jon at the North, that when his mutiny stabbing attempt happens, that's essentially getting blood on the mirrors, which calls the Skinner, which is like the Ice Dragon others. But that's a different video. Another change, Robb doesn't maim Joffrey physically or directly in battlefield. Rather, Robb constantly outwits Tywin and wins many battles, thereby hurting, quote, King Joffrey's rule. But this was only able to happen because of the Bolton betrayal. So again, George had to expand this a little bit. Another change, Rickon is not mentioned in this outline. And then Bran in a coma dream, that begins his flight. Just as later at the end of A Dance with Dragons, Daenerys has her liminal space dream while out in the Dothraki Sea. So George has said over and over again, I have the quote somewhere on the blog, that Bran and Dany are the two most magical. They are the height of the ruling parallels in this story. They are the most magical. They are the ones that are building in information, in power, in wisdom throughout the story. They're the ones that we should be looking out for. Probably not in the best way that everybody wants the ending to be. So Bran learning to fly, which is a Martin World way of saying rebuilding after the long night. The long night is essentially George's A Song of Ice and Fire, Interregnum. Woo, huzzah! The Interregnum. This is where science and magic merge into the truth so that society can heal and progress. The seed is strong. Bran being the seed of the tree, of Bloodraven, of the green seers, however you want to phrase it, the seed is strong. What is the Interregnum, Leech? What is this? What is this? This is a huge plot factor running across like all of George's Thousand Worlds universe. No, Song of Ice and Fire is not sneakily in his Thousand Worlds universe, but both of these story collections are in his Martin World bag of tricks. Briefly, the Interregnum is the historical period between the collapse and the resumption of Starflight. So when Bloodraven tells Bran that he'll never walk again, he will learn to fly, that is societal advancement, and Bran is going to be the one to usher that in through the fact that green seeing means enlightenment. I'll link to that if you want. So by its very nature, the Interregnum is difficult to date, just like we have with Aegon's conquest. That started, Aegon and the Valyrians landing in Westeros started the imbalance in nature in this story. So again, back to George's idea that there are two outlying factors that are the greatest threat, as he says above in this, and that is the two dragons, the Ice Dragon Other and the Fire Dragon Targaryens. Those are the two extremes that are, especially in magic, that are probably making the seasons go out of whack. Something like that. That's another video, though. So then we get to George saying that Jon Snow, the bastard, will remain in the far north. He will mature into a ranger of great daring and ultimately will succeed his uncle as the commander of the Night's Watch. When Winterfell burns, Catelyn Stark will be forced to flee north with her son Bran and her daughter Arya. Wounded by Lannister riders, they will seek refuge at the Wall. So I'm not going to read the whole story or the whole section here, but I'm going to get to some of the changes. A change. So it seems that Catelyn will have left King's Landing and make it back to Winterfell, then to have have to flee Winterfell after it burns. In our printed canon, though, Cat never makes it back to Winterfell. Neither does the other cat. And Bran never left Winterfell to go down to King's Landing anyway. Maybe there's a green seeing element that George has decided to sort of retcon as we get the next book, but we'll see. Another change. No wounded Lannisters riders take refuge at the Wall. Maybe this is something we will see again later in the books. If there is a wounded Lannister rider that takes refuge at the Wall. This is a detail George stole from his story, The Ice Dragon, actually, but adapted it to fit A Song of Ice and Fire. Instead, we have Tyrion voluntarily visit the Night's Watch. And then later, Tywin sends his little lickspittle, Janos Slynt, to play political games that Cersei then continues on at the Wall. Oh, so another change is Benjen was never Lord Commander. And then another change, and maybe this is something that George hasn't totally omitted, but has drastically adjusted, and we won't see it until The Winds of Winter or Dream of Spring, is in this section, it says that Jon and Bran are going to have a bitter estrangement. This was something that George stole from his story for a Single Yesterday, which I have on my blog in the reread section if you want to take a look at that story. This is where the dynamic happens when a King of Winter arrives. I've been saying for years that Jon Snow is going to be Jon Snow, the King of Winter. I did not pull that out of my buttocks. I pulled that out of Martin World, huzzah. And the more we get through with Song of Ice and Fire, the more it seems to be true. Also, the bitter estrangement between brothers seems to be moved to the Bolton Snow, Stark Snow clashes that we're about to see. The Stark, or even the Stark and Karstark. Basically, it's brothers, some symbolic brothers to the Starks, connected to the Starks, that are now have a bitter estrangement, like the Karstarks and Jon Snow and Ramsay Snow being, quote, brothers by name, and the whole taking over Winterfell thing. So, and then another change. This is a huge change, and this is a change I'm going to talk about a lot in another video I'm going to make about incest and the way George writes it in general, is Arya and Jon never fall in incest love with each other. George pretty much confirms this word for word at Balticon 50, and I have all of the notes on my blog if you want to read it. So there's no Stark incest, and thank the gods, because that means something awful would have to happen to them, because it's Martin World, and incest on all levels in Martin World is deadly and brings about a downfall of a dynasty, either large scale or small scale, whether it's, again, the Karstarks, whether it's Jaime and Cersei, whether it's even possibly Minissa Went, and a few other like sea level examples. I have a whole page on this. I'm going to make a video about it pretty soon, but I will put the links to what I have already in the notes here if you want to take a look at it ahead of time. Because, Jon and Arya are not they're not siblings. They are cousins. Yes, in Westeros, incest includes cousin to cousin. It says so right in the books with those words. Not going to go into it all right now, but it is not common in the Stark line, like people say. There was the one instance where there was a Manderly in there that was trying to quite possibly usurp some sort of control over the Starks, which we see that happening again in A Song of Ice and Fire. So, another subject, another topic. And then George does say that the passion will continue until the secret of Jon's true parentage is finally revealed in the last book. So Jon having a true parentage reveal at the end tells us that there certainly was a mystery written to to Jon's origins from the get-go. So abandoned by the Night's Watch, Catelyn and her children will find their only hope of safety that lies even further north, beyond the Wall, where they fall into the hands of Mance Rayder, the king beyond the Wall, and get the dreadful glimpse of the inhuman others as they attack the wildling encampment. Bran's magic, Arya's sword and needle, and the savagery of their dire wolves will help them survive, but their mother Catelyn will die at the hands of the others. Okay, a change. The Night's Watch never abandons the family or anyone in our canon story. As a matter of fact, readers are shown the opposite. Everything from when Lord Commander Mormont offers to take in Craster and his family in order to protect them from the White Walkers, and even later in A Dance with Dragons, when Jon takes in the Free Folk and Alice Karstark, another fake Arya. So we have another fake Arya that makes it to the Wall. That's where Alice Karstark came from. And there's some flirting and stuff like that. But just like in this outline, Jon and Arya never actually act on anything. There's no actual incest that happens. Alice Karstark gets to see Jon and she flirts with him and she talks about remembering him. Nothing ever happens physically between them. So there's a whole different reason for George adding incest that I think a lot of readers haven't figured out yet. I'll just say it. Another change that's sort of a change is it's a change with a twist. It's Catelyn still dies at the hand of the others, but this changes now the others of the Riverlands, which they're either the others or the whites, however you want to think of them, and that's the phrase. They're probably more like whites, or like the Sand King mobiles from George's story Sand Kings. Tywin is the main big fiery hand that controls them. And Catelyn dies by the others or by the whites, just in the Riverlands. And the phrase being the other White Walkers of the Riverlands is something that I've been mentioning for actually quite a while. I'll write something about it one day soon. But this is just another example of George's world building. Now we get to some of the really cool stuff. Over across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys Targaryen will discover that her new husband, the Dothraki Khal Drogo, has little interest in invading the Seven Kingdoms, much to her brother's frustration. When Viserys presses his claims past the point of tact or wisdom, Khal Drogo will finally grow annoyed and kill him out of hand, eliminating the Targaryen pretender and leaving Daenerys as the last of her line. Daenerys's something will bide her time, but she will not forget. When the moment is right, she will kill her husband to avenge her brother, and then flee with a trusted friend into the wilderness, but beyond Vaes Dothrak. There, hunted by something unclear of her life, she stumbles on something about a clutch of dragon's eggs. A young dragon will give Daenerys the power to bend the Dothraki to her will. She then begins to plan for her invasion of the Seven Kingdoms. So, just like Jon's story of his origins, his parentage has been built in as from the beginning, George has been planning what's happening on the Daenerys front to be an invasion. Even in the books, Dany mentions that her father lost the throne. She says just that. Her father lost the throne. And then, again, think back to what the throne means. It's Ozymandias. It's actually not something that should even exist. It needs to be dismantled and taken down. So, the trusted friend is presumably Jorah Mormont here. So, and I want to expand on the bending to her will idea. George has said his initial intent for the Targaryens and Daenerys was not to have them as literal animalian dragons. There was not going to be a big Drogon in the story, but rather the Targaryens, specifically Daenerys, they were going to have pyrokinesis powers. So while Daenerys discovers her waking the dragon powers in her fever dream, she's also having a proximity telepathy influence over those around her. The proximity telepathy influence is something straight out of George's story and 7 Times Never Kill a Man. I will link to it. It's linked in this post already. What that is anytime that there's a fiery main character in the stories, including like in Star Lady or in Armageddon Rag, The Glass Flower, and 7 Times Never Kill Man, A Song for Lya. Anytime that there's this fiery main character, they have this somebody with like a magical element, not quite Cersei, but somebody like Dany, as George has said, is between her and Bran are the most magical. They have this way of influencing people that are close to them. Melisandre does this to Stannis. When these people are close to them, they like emit this telepathy thing, this mind control. It's only when this person moves away from the fiery element that their mind clears and they start to think on their own. Think of Jaime always doing everything that Cersei says, but by the time we last see Jaime, he's been away from her for several weeks at that time, and Cersei's influence at the time has been wearing off, and Jaime burns her letters at this point. If Jaime gets back around Cersei, goes back to Cersei in any sort of proximity of her, he's going to fall under her influence again. Catelyn having to go north and having a sept built in the north. A fiery septs are symbols of fire. They are built inside of, it was built inside of Winterfell, which is, again, the tree symbol. There's a fire that invades the tree area. That's the same thing. So, what do I mean that there wasn't going to be a Drogon in the story? Oh my God, we have to have dragons. They're so cool. They're smart. They talk, and dragons are just totally awesome. It's not about the dragon itself. It's not about the Animalian dragon. It's what George has put in there for what they symbolize. And he does say, I did consider at the very early stages not having the dragons in there. I wanted the Targaryen symbol to be the dragons, but I did play with the notion that maybe it was like a psionic power, that it was pyrokinesis, that they could conjure up flames with their minds. I went back and forth. My friend and fellow fantasy writer, Phyllis Eisenstein, actually was the one who convinced me to put the dragons in, and I dedicated the third book to her, and I think it was the right call. And just want to pause for a second that at the time of this recording, Phyllis has passed away about 6 months ago, and George on his blog did write, took him a little bit of time. It was a personal loss, deep personal loss, but he did write a little something to her. So another change, sort of, it's more of a clarification, is Khal Drogo does have little interest in invading the Seven Kingdoms. It's not until the wine merchant tries to poison Dany that Khal Drogo seems to change his mind. This is when Daenerys starts her waking the dragon practice, when she has Viserys's golden blood spilled on him. This line says, a young dragon will give Daenerys power to bend the Dothraki to her will. That's the way that it actually worked out on page. So all of these things happened. They just didn't happen the way, if you were to just read the outline and just go one-to-one with the outline without assuming that there's going to be some expectation changes in our interpretations. All of this stuff still happened. The golden blood incident, that was part of Dany waking her dragon. That was the proximity telepathy. That was Dany having a mind control element in burning her brother. That was her waking the dragon. Fire doesn't kill a dragon. Fire wakes a dragon. Daenerys' invasion. George calls it an invasion. I think at least twice in this outline. It's laid out on line by line on a page I have called the Steel Andal Invasion. Again, this is Martin World stuff and what George is doing with Dany in A Song of Ice and Fire. So I'm not pulling any of this out of thin air. I'm sticking with author intent. A change that Daenerys doesn't stumble on a clutch of dragon eggs, but is given them as a fiery wedding gift from Illyrio Mopatis. Later in A Clash of Kings, Daenerys comes across a dragon bones in the Red Waste. I don't know, but I always kind of assumed that this was George having a little fun with it. That Dany was first supposed to stumble on dragon eggs out in the desert, and George does it still, but this time it's a wink and a nod to a previous long night. It's a wink and a nod, a little bit of suggestion to what Dany's future is going to be in the series. So again, he kept it in there, but he kind of rearranged it in a fun sort of way. Also, this clutch of dragon eggs that somebody just stumbles on is a lot like Ghost leading Jon to the cache of dragon glass, which happens in the same book. So then we get to some parts about Tyrion. And he says, Tyrion Lannister will continue to travel, to plot, and to play the Game of Thrones, finally removing his nephew Joffrey in disgust at the Boy King's brutality. Jaime Lannister will follow Joffrey on the throne of the Seven Kingdoms by the simple expedient of killing of everyone ahead of him in line of succession and blaming his brother Tyrion for the murders. Exile, Tyrion will change sides, making common cause with the surviving Starks to bring his brother down, and falling helplessly in love with Arya Stark while he's at it. His passion is, alas, unreciprocated, but no less intense for that, and it will lead to a deadly rivalry between Tyrion and Jon Snow. So a few changes to this. Tyrion dislikes Joffrey when Joffrey's alive, but he never plotted against him. That was changed into the fabricated lies and exaggerations that we see at Tyrion's trial. Another change, Jaime doesn't follow Joffrey to the throne. Instead, Martin has Jaime plop his butt down on the throne after Tywin takes King's Landing from the Mad King Aerys. Jaime doesn't want the throne. He seems to be a very different character now than what George initially had planned for him, even though some of his plot movements are probably going to be the same. And he might have a similar ending, but again, like I was saying with proximity telepathy, Jaime gets back close within range of Cersei, that mind control connection is going to snap back up. Tyrion did go into exile hiding, but he seems to be currently mixed up with the new Blackfyre Targaryen, however you want to look at that subplot, which I love. I love the Blackfyre subplot. That's one of my favorites in the series as a whole. It does have some residual Stark issues to deal with, and also there's a lot of. It's like Aegon the Sixth is almost like an alternate Jon Snow. Like, what would happen if Jon did things this way? If Jon was raised differently? Aegon, for the most part, not 100%, but Aegon, for the most part, seems to be an alternate Jon Snow in the canon that we have now. No doubt Tyrion will play the demon monkey as he runs between the fire side and the green side of the story. Jon is on the green side. It's not even though it's Jon Snow, King of Winter, blah blah blah. But talking about the magical route, the river that he follows of magic, that is a green magic. All of that is green magic. So it's more about like the plot and the intent and what it serves rather than just simply a name. So it also seems that George decided there were one too many, quote, deadly rivalries or love triangles in the story. The Arya-Jon incest angle had been kicked out of the door. So a triangle with Tyrion maybe was lost. I don't know. We're going to have to see. If Jon and Dany actually do hook up somehow, instead of it being the Jon alternate that we have in the story, Aegon the Sixth, if Jon and Dany do hook up, it's going to be bad. I cannot stress this enough. Nobody should be shipping them together. It's going to be bad. It's going to be the whole proximity telepathy again. It's not good. It's no bueno. It's no good. Tyrion could be involved with that. We're going to have to wait and see how George decides to handle it in his own story. I tend to think it's going to be, for the most part, between like Dany and Aegon, especially with only 2 books that are left, and with all the battles and all the big stuff that's happening elsewhere. This also brings me to the idea that I know there's a common idea in the fandom that Quentin is the Sun's son because, you know, he's his Martell sigil and stuff like that. But again, you have to kind of look at the role everybody's playing. Jon is the Sun's son. I will link to this. It's also already linked in this blog page. Jon is the Sun's son. When Dany got that message via vision and whatnot, those are warnings to her. Jon is the Sun's son, being it can trace either way, either being Rhaegar's son, or which Rhaegar was sort of peeling away from the Targaryen family standard of operations, or because Jon has, or that ghost has, two eyes like Red Sun. So there's a green seeing element there. Jon being connected to Bran via Ghost, who has two suns for eyes. There's not a million different ways. That's exaggeration. I hate exaggeration. But there's a couple different ways that makes Jon the Sun's son. And again, this is also in Martin World. It's been hinted at and used. That same trope has been used in other Martin World stories. Besides, Val is probably going to be the one that is going to have a larger impact, long-term impact on Jon than anything else. Again, it's written within Martin World. Huzzah! Okay, this brings me to like the final section in the outline. Everybody in the fandom always goes on and on. Oh, George wrote this Stark incest, and Jon and Arya are going to get together. No, we just went through it. He never actually says that Jon and Arya actually got together, having feelings for each other, and this weird prototype outline that George says he hates writing, because if he has to put in an outline, that means he's already written the story and he loses interest in it. But if he puts a few general ideas in there and decides along the way that no, this isn't going to work, or no, I'm going to have more sympathy, I already have more sympathy for the Stark, so that means he has to eliminate the incest. Yeah, the entire next part, the final possible revelations about the outcomes of anything is blacked out. It's literally blacked out. We don't know what happens. So you can't say things like, oh, George wanted Stark incest in there from the beginning and he's keeping it. We don't know that. We don't know how Dany ends. We don't know how Bran ends. We don't know how Jaime ends. Nothing. Literally the next whole graph section is blacked out. And then George's final line in this says, but that's the second book. So again, we can use this outline as a guide if you are a Martin World reader. You can start to arrange the puzzle pieces into what is very consistent with George, with his actual published work, rather than these loose notes. It's really just loose notes. Okay, so where did I get the idea that George was making up shit? Well, I don't know if anybody knows this, and this is I'm not trying to be the braggiest Leech. I'm trying to be the truthful Leech. And I kind of hate talking about it because I feel like it puts too much focus on me, and I don't like that. So again, Balticon, back in 2016, I went there and I was able to have the dinner with him where he sat like elbow to elbow with me. We talked about a lot of things. I met him a couple more times over I think it was like a 4-day weekend. And the last day, which was a Monday, I got to sit with him at a coffee talk, a Kaffee Klatsch. I'm probably butchering that word, but a coffee talk. And he was asked about the outline by my con friend that I was with. And she asked it in the sense that she still was hoping that Arya and Jon would get together like in the outline. And over the course of the weekend, George debunked that a couple of times. I have the entire Balticon report written up. If you want to see it, I will link to it. So, but this is a snippet of what he said. He says, So I said, look, if I want to get back to being a novelist, I'm going to have to sell this even though it's not finished. So I had my 200 pages of Game of Thrones at that point, but they wanted an outline. I said, I don't do outlines. I don't know what's going to happen. I figure it out as I go. And that's how I always did it. No, we have to have an outline. So I wrote 2 pages and a 2-page thing about what I thought would happen. It would be a trilogy. It'll be 3 books: Game of Thrones, The Dance with Dragons, and Winds of Winter. Those were the 3 window titles. And it'll be 3 books, and this will happen, and that'll happen, and this will happen. And I was making up shit. And I had thought about those 2 pages. I had thought those 2 pages were long forgotten because, of course, the books did sell. They sold in the United States and in Great Britain both. They sold for enough money that I didn't have to take any more Hollywood games. I love that. Anyway, so I was able to say no. I had a few less something or another's to wind up in 94, 95. Once I had that done, I said, no, I don't want to take any more movies or TV shows. I'm going to write these books now. And I started writing the books. And in the process, I pretty much disregarded the outline. The characters took me off in entirely different directions. So for 20 years, I had forgotten that 2-page thing even existed. And then someone in my British publisher, HarperCollins, that office, they got a new office building and brand new offices and new conference rooms, big conference rooms that they had decorated with books and stuff like that. And they named the conference room after the writers. So one of the conference rooms, something, they put up these plastic display cases, including the outline, the 2-page outline. Yes, something. They didn't ask my permission. They just put it up. And in the 2-page outline, Jon and Arya become a romantic item. And then he goes on to debunk how that's not going to happen. Because over the course of the weekend, he was asked about this romantic pairing a couple of times. I have it all recorded. And he says, nope, that's not going to happen. And then he talks about Gendry. So Gendry is also a Jon alternative. Just like Aegon is a Jon alternative, Gendry is also a Jon alternative. They're both Smiths, one literally, one symbolically. They're both bastards of kings or potential kings, literally and symbolically. There's a million reasons why. So it's going to be the Jon alternative, Gendry, not Jon himself. Yeah, so I really can't stress this enough. Like, if you ship incest pairings in A Song of Ice and Fire, they're always going to end badly. Because George is not promoting incest. He's not doing it because Egyptians, other European royalty, he has his own reasons, his own author intent. And again, we'll get to that later. So I want to thank everybody for being here. If you have your own thoughts or ideas on the outline, like I said, I did not include, in this video, I did not include everything. I have more notes and all the links and such on the blog page, which I'll link to. And I'm always up for discussing Martin World. And take this. What am I going to leave you with? What information am I going to leave you with? Take this as a guide, as notes, because more than anything else, George's own writing style, his own Martin World intent trumps everything. So thank you for hanging around with the jambles and jumbles of the Fattest Leech of Ice and Fire by Gumbo. You guys are all fantastic. And let's get to reading some more Martin World. Huzzah!